Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin, and as the engineer, I like to cut through all the nonsense and just look for reliable signals in our politics.
And I'm Jonathan, and as a professor, I tend to provide a little bit of that nonsense for Justin to cut through. Today, as we're filming, the hurricanes are in the news. And as you would expect, we're going to be talking about the apolitical response to the hurricanes, how everybody's pooling together and getting behind these residents who are suffering and really supporting the federal government. And obviously, I'm kidding, because that's not happening at all. The federal government and FEMA are doing their jobs. There's a lot of political sniping going on from all sorts of weird and wacky places that we'll cover a bit as we move on. We're also going to just touch in briefly on the latest in the Russia business. Bob Woodward has kind of chimed in on that. And we'll very, very briefly touch base with the New York Times poll, because something interesting came out in their polls this week. As we get started, I have one of the local beers. I thought it was time I sort of get some of the local Lafayette beers in play. This is a hazy IPA, codenamed Superfan, from Odd 13, and I've got my Odd 13 shirt on in conjunction with that. In any case, this is they call it a Colorado hazy IPA. It's like your typical New England hazy IPA, but not quite as sweet, which I like a lot better. I don't like a really sweet beer. So it's got those tropical notes, but also some dank bitterness that I expect anyway in a more traditional IPA. So this is a really, really solid beer, flagship beer of Odd 13.
Well, my drink of choice, as the father of two young boys, and to celebrate these monster hurricanes, Monster Energy is what I'm drinking.
If I didn't already not drink Monster, I wouldn't, because they bought Oscar Blues, which I thought was really horrible. So Oscar Blues is now owned, and a couple breweries associated with them are now owned by Monster, which is just bizarre to think about.
So for our first segment, we're going to discuss FEMA and how the current administration is responding to the hurricanes. The way I want to structure this first, though, is I want to talk about Hurricane Katrina and how much of a disaster that was. Then I want to talk about the lessons learned from that and how each administration from the Obama administration forward has leveraged these lessons. And then I want to talk about how Trump is using these series of natural disasters to score some political points.
Which I'm sure is shocking everyone who's listening.
Yeah, I am shocked.
As you say, it's useful, as a very useful point of departure to start with Katrina and then contrast what's going on since. Because it really does show, hey, you know what? The federal government can learn some lessons and get its crap together. By pretty much every non-lunatic measure, right? FEMA has been doing a really good job lately.
I mean, it's not just lately.
Well, sure.
Since 2006, really. So, Katrina had multiple points of failure. The most obvious one was that the levees broke. I can't really blame, the Bush administration or the governor of Louisiana. That was just a problem that was festering for years and years and years. The Army Corps of Engineers said, hey, this isn't going to be able to withstand a Category 5 hurricane. And everyone just said, okay, and just left it at that. And as we all know, once the levees flooded, it was game over.
I believe there's a Led Zeppelin song about that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Another issue was the governor of Louisiana didn't request federal assistance on time. So under something called the Stafford Act, we have to respect federalism in our country. So the federal government can't just go into a state and say, hey, we're in charge. That's just not how things work. So the governor will always have to make a request to the federal government. Now, where the Bush administration really failed was that FEMA was kind of second fiddle, right? FEMA is part of the Department of Homeland Security. And as we all remember, back in the early to mid 2000s, Homeland Security was all about counterterrorism. So FEMA was really an afterthought. The head of FEMA, the administrator, didn't even have any disaster experience. So around 2006, there were several congressional inquiries, and they basically passed some new legislation that basically said, hey, the head of FEMA needs to have experience. It's just an obvious thing to have. In addition to that, periodically, at least once every 2 years, there'll be a large national exercise that's supposed to simulate some sort of real world event, such as a massive flood or hurricane, massive wildfire, things like that. So the people who work for FEMA actually get practice. If the military does drills so that they are combat ready, well, the same principle applies to FEMA.
And I think it's interesting to look at the whole thing from like the typical perspective of government, right? We are, at least our government, we are really good at addressing the last crisis. So if you think about the early 2000s, right, the last crisis was 9/11. Department of Homeland Security is obviously going to be focusing on that. And we learned a lot of lessons. Thank goodness we have not had anything like that since, but we're much better with that than we were. After Katrina, hey, that didn't go very well at all. We're going to learn lessons from that. The government has learned lessons from that. FEMA has progressed quite a ways from the really haphazard and ineffective response from what happened in Katrina. And I would guess that in any scenario that we're likely to see, the federal government knows it's going to be blamed if things go wrong, right? So if a governor is late asking for help, I'm going to be pretty confident that whoever's president at the time is going to be a little bit proactive in saying, hey, you know what? Let's ask for help so we can get things rolling, right? And it seems like if that's not at least not happened, at the very least, the states know that they know how the system works and they know how to get things rolling. And that hasn't been a problem, as you say, since Katrina, of having a late response.
Right. And we also want to point out that this is a multi-tier effort, right? So you have the federal response, you have the governor's response, but you also have the response from local authorities, right? So during Katrina, it was really haphazard, right? Now, the feds, they have something called incident management assistance teams, which can deploy, they're basically like EMTs, but for disasters. They can get to any place in America within 12 hours and basically set up shop, which, we're kind of conditioned to think that the government is inefficient, but I would argue that this is one of the few things that the government does really, really well.
There's your former Republican side coming through. I think there's a fair number of things that the government does do pretty well.
Oh, I know.
Because we don't think of, if we don't have to think about it, government probably is doing a decent enough job. But I think one thing you forgot to mention too, that is also important, is they do a good job of coordinating, right?
Right.
All this stuff doesn't come from, say, Florida when there's an incident in Florida, or North Carolina when there's an incident in North Carolina. They get teams from all over the country to come in and help. Just anecdotally, I have a friend that works for a rescue team in Ohio, and he deploys all over the country when we have things that happen like this. So FEMA is, whatever the process is for coordinating, and I don't know the deep details on this, but the coordination is another important aspect of what happens in disaster response.
Right. So let's move on to the current set of hurricanes. And, we have to preface this with, there are going to be more hurricanes. So we've had Hurricane Helene. We've now had Hurricane Milton hit the west coast of Florida. I think through November, at least, we will typically have more hurricanes. I guess, Jonathan, you're fact checking me on that.
I think that hurricane season starts usually in June. That's what I thought. But you're right, it goes through November. But hopefully we're headed towards the end. I wanted to check that before just saying, no, you're wrong, because I wasn't entirely sure. Since I don't live there, I don't keep the calendar. But I thought it started earlier because it's in the summer. And so hopefully we're towards the end.
So with the Biden administration, Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina, he followed the procedures, right? There was massive flooding in western North Carolina. Prior to all of that, he declared his state of emergency. The Biden administration basically said, hey, you said the magic words. Now we can get the ball rolling. And before Hurricane Milton hit Florida, Ron DeSantis did the same thing.
So I think a really good measure of how well the federal government and FEMA are doing is looking at the response from people from the other party, right? We would expect the Democratic governor of North Carolina to say, yeah, things are great. But all of the people sort of on the ground in North Carolina, in Florida, all the Republicans are saying everything's working pretty well. There have been no real problems. Right? The federal government and the states are cooperating really well. There's been no complaints, right, about realistic issues from local officials on either party. So that ought to give you an idea. If the local Republicans aren't complaining, something must be going all right from the FEMA perspective.
Right. I would agree with that. So, who are the people who say it's not going well? You want to tell us, Jonathan?
Oh, I'll bet you can guess. But Donald Trump, of course, is leading the charge, right? And nobody can be surprised by this. What's going on, though, is a little bit surprising in sort of the lengths they're going to. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I was still a little bit shocked when I heard that FEMA doesn't have money for you because they're spending all the money on illegal immigrants, which is just not a thing, right? The government has tasked FEMA with some sort of housing support for some of the migrants that have come across, but all of that money is from a completely different pool than the disaster preparedness money and the FEMA response to hurricanes, and that's not an issue whatsoever.
Right.
But
where the conflation is that the Department of Homeland Security owns FEMA, right?
Yes.
So FEMA, they do have an operational budget that comes from the Department of Homeland Security, but the disaster relief fund is, as you said, completely separate. And so Trump is basically saying, they're all the same and all those illegals are taking your money. That's what it really boils down to.
And more than conflation, I think we can just say he's just lying, right? There's absolutely no truth to it, which again, that's not going to really be a surprise to anybody that I'm sure that's listening to this. But the rumors kind of actually get worse from there, right? That there are rumors that there's no aid for Republican areas, right? That FEMA is confiscating property if you ask for help. That FEMA is not accepting claims. That there's like a $750 cap on claims. That they have no money. That they're keeping the Red Cross out. They're keeping out other people that want to help. More or less, that FEMA is getting in the way. And this kind of stuff does real harm because it deters some people from bothering, right? They think, well, FEMA is on the take. FEMA's just not going to help us. Why bother? And people are suffering needlessly because they listen to somebody who is lying through his teeth, not to help them, but to get the rest of his MAGA-ites riled up as usual. And if that's not enough, right, if you want to have something that's even more preposterous, our good friend Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying to convince everybody that the government caused this hurricane on purpose because, of course, the government can control the weather.
Well, how else are the Democrats going to win North Carolina?
Well,
it makes perfect sense to me.
I don't know if you happened to catch Jon Stewart this week. We've been trying to catch him on Mondays because he's only on Mondays. But he liked the whole weather thing, and he thought it was back to the Jewish space lasers. And he thought, you know what? If we really can't control the weather, why don't we make it less humid in Florida? Because that's where all the Jews are. Which was a very good point, right? There's much better use for controlling the weather on a regular basis. I wouldn't just roll it out for the occasional disaster either. There's lots of good things you could do with the capability to control the weather in this way.
There you go. So in addition to all the stuff you have to deal with natural disasters, FEMA has created a web page dedicated to debunking these rumors. So I just found that funny in a really sad way in addition to boots on the ground and, making sure people have shelter, food, all that, they have to deal with disinformation and misinformation.
Better yet, you and I and everybody else listening to this, more or less, is paying for that. We have to pay for the government to tell people that, no, we're in fact not controlling the weather and didn't cause this hurricane on purpose to affect the election. It's maddening.
So the congressman who's in charge of Western North Carolina, his name is Chuck Edwards. He actually posted on Twitter this debunking document, if you will. And the first thing he starts out with is, as you mentioned, Marjorie Taylor Greene's weather controlling stuff. And, as a side note, I don't know if our listeners remember Madison Cawthorn, but he was one of those really wild MAGA types.
Wild meaning crazy.
Yes. He started all these rumors that, and maybe they're not rumors to be honest, but that everyone was just doing coke and having all these orgies. And Kevin McCarthy was like,
suspected Mitch McConnell of being up to. So yeah,
yeah,
that was easy to believe. Like, thanks there, Madison.
But it definitely irked Kevin McCarthy. But anyway, Chuck Edwards' primary is Madison Cawthorn. So for those of you who think that your local elections don't matter, they certainly do. Because would you want Madison Cawthorn in charge of your congressional district during a disaster like this?
We would probably not be able to say that the local officials on the ground think things are fine. I'm sure he would find ways to start and echo some of these absurd conspiracies. So I think what's interesting, to think about is not these are ridiculous conspiracies, and it's not worth entertaining any of them as even remotely true, because they're not. But why do they think that these are going to work, right? Because, and I guess the real thing is because they do, unfortunately, right? They meaning Trump and the other MAGA politicians, have primed their supporters to believe this kind of crap for so long that the response is, well, of course it is. And just watching CNN a little bit today at lunch, they are talking about people who they met and they interview that are thinking, oh, well, you can't call FEMA because they're doing this and this and this. And it's a shame that the government is causing this hurricane. And people eat this stuff up because they've primed them to. And it's kind of tragic how they're manipulating their voters to just believe this nonsense. And at the same time, this is one of those incidents where it's doing real harm to people. And it's not the first time, right? There's real harm being done to, say, the Haitian migrants and the people of Springfield that have to adjourn school on a regular basis because there's bomb threats, right? There's real harm done to the judge in Colorado that sentenced Tina Peters to jail for election mishandling. Mishandling is even too light, election crimes, because he's now getting death threats, and as are other people in the court, right? This sort of conspiracy theory world is normal to them. And it's become so normal because the people that they look to as leaders are drilling it home time after time after time.
Yeah. And I'm on the website right now, and some of these, it's just so sad. One of the main rumors that they have to debunk is FEMA is turning away volunteers and cash donations. Sure. Imagine, you're just someone who actually really wants to help. And then you just hear, through, your social network or something like that, hey, you know what? You can't volunteer.
Can't give money. That's
easy. Boots on the ground. That actually causes harm to people.
Yeah. And so does lack of funds, right? If the government ever needs anything for these things, it's giving them money. It doesn't always need people that aren't going to help, that aren't going to be useful, but it can always use more money.
Yeah, my favorite rumor is FEMA distributes aid based on demographic characteristics. So they've gotten this DEI.
The DEI hurricane aid. I still have to go with the work that we're creating the weather. I like that one the best.
Well, they did not debunk that one, actually.
Well, yeah, because when you have a flat world, it's easy to control the weather, right?
Oh, geez.
But yeah, so, what the question I think that then comes from that is like, why do they do it? Because it does kind of work. But what do you do if you're, say, the Harris campaign, right? Because it's kind of crass to come out and play politics with this. And so I think she's right by not doing that right now, right? You just say he's ridiculous and call him out for playing politics with it, and go about trying to solve the problem. And I think that they're taking a good approach there. The Biden-Harris administration is handling this about as well as it can be. Hopefully they'll be able to do the same in Florida. But all recent precedent indicates they probably will, right? So you don't want to get down in the mud with them. But where I think there is kind of an opening is what's going to happen next, right? Because I've been reading a lot lately, and we've been talking a little bit about it too, of what's going on with insurance rates in these areas and other rates in the country, other places in the country, that as these disasters become more and more common, right, home insurance rates are going through the roof. North Carolina in particular is sort of in the spotlight now because they have for the first time ever, really, a competitive race for state insurance adjuster, right, or insurance commissioner, right, because the insurance companies want to raise home insurance rates 42% this year, up to 99% in some of the coastal areas. And that's quite a hefty increase. And a lot of people will have a problem with that. And that's the kind of thing where I think there ought to be some sort of political focus. And that would be, if I'm going to talk about the politics of these disasters, I'm going to wait a little bit, first of all, but then that's what I'm going to talk about. So now we've survived. How do we clean up? And we need to make sure that everybody can clean up. One way to do that is to make sure insurance stays affordable for people. That would be the one thing I would do if I was going to think about using this for political reasons. But again, respectfully, and wait.
Sure. So I think the flaw in that argument, though, is the waiting, right? I feel that the American, the memory of the average American voter is not that great. And by December,
well, I mean, by waiting, I mean like not while the hurricane is actually going on, not while people are missing. Obviously, if you're going to bring it up, you got to bring it up before the election. There's no point in bringing it up,
sure,
November 10th, right? But I would not do it while it's active rescue, right? It's right. While things are when we're helping people get back to their lives, right? Then I might point out that, hey, we would help you even more and make sure it stays affordable. Would Donald Trump do that? And put him on the spot to say what he would do, because it would be an interesting rant, because I'm sure he would not be necessarily in favor of this. But who knows? He could surprise you. You never know.
Yeah, I think the best thing for Harris would be to just appear with Biden, right? Just be a good leader. That's all she really needs to do. She has an advantage by being part of the administration. If the administration is doing a good job, it's going to look good for her. And then I wouldn't even actively campaign, to be honest. I would just have Tim Walz campaign. You know what? And have your surrogates campaign for you. Say have Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro.
An approach. You could say, I'm not available for the next few days because I'm doing this.
Right.
And then have some press things where they can film you doing this, so it can make the news. But yeah, that could be a useful approach.
So I also think that from Trump's perspective, I think he looks at what happened to Bush with Hurricane Katrina. It reflected poorly on the Bush administration. He saw that when Chris Christie said that Obama did a good job, that it hurt the Romney campaign in 2012. And then Trump had his own hurricane disasters. What was the one that hit Texas? And then there was another one that hit Puerto Rico.
Yeah, the one that really hurt him was the Puerto Rico one where he's throwing out paper
and so exactly. So I think there's just a little bit of a wound to his ego there. And so Trump, frankly, doesn't care about what has happened. He just wants to throw dirt at the administration, right? That's what it really boils down to, I think.
Yeah. And I think that would be an interesting avenue to, like, it could very easily have a commercial where Donald Trump is talking about nonsense and then saying what a great person Marjorie Taylor Greene is, and then have of course they're controlling the weather, and kind of contrast, just to kind of highlight how loony they are for any undecided voters that might still be remaining out there. And apparently there must be some, because we're being inundated with ads here in Colorado. I guess you're probably not seeing so many.
All of our ads are proposition ads.
Yep.
I mean, I would just have a political ad with Trump with the Sharpie.
Yeah, there you go.
And then just show Harris doing leadership things. To me, that's a good contrast.
All right. So the next bit, we're going to go back to Donald Trump's favorite topic. Russia is back in the news this week. I don't know if you've happened to catch it, but Bob Woodward is coming out with a book on, among other topics, the war in Ukraine. and Donald Trump's sort of reactions throughout his presidency. And a couple of the big reveals are, one, that Trump is still talking with Putin on at least a semi-regular basis. He's talked to him at least half a dozen times since he's been out of office, and that he gave him equipment for COVID tests on the sly back in 2020. And I think to most people who are reasonable observers, it's not a stretch to believe, hey, you know what? Trump is in the bag for Putin. That's not real news. It is kind of interesting for a couple reasons. One, it's kind of dumb enough that it might be the kind of thing that would catch people's attention. It's not an intricate policy thing. It's Trump gave him COVID tests when we couldn't get him at home. Maybe there's something there to mine if you're Harris. Maybe not. But I think another interesting thing, and I know the thing that interests you here, is the whole question about, wait a minute, if you knew this, why are you just putting it out now? Is it to just sell your book? And is that really the thing we ought to expect, and the standard we should hold our sort of news investigative reporters to?
So it's interesting, right? I've read the Trump books by Bob Woodward, and they are really good reads. I was like on the edge of my seat.
Yeah, all of Woodward's books, his books are really good. He had a good Obama book. He's got all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, part of this is just specific to him. He is a journalist, yes, but he doesn't work for a major news organization anymore, right? He's working for himself, and then he likes to tell a story.
Sure.
So on one hand, I can just say, hey, you know what? Like, that's fine. But where it gets kind of dicey is when you have information that you sit on that could actually help people. So not in this current book, which is mainly about the Biden administration, but in his previous book, I don't know if it was a second or a third Trump book, but he talks about how Trump knew way back in, say, January, how awful COVID was, right? And I think, people who are really, really informed, they knew that there was some virus going on in China that was bad, but they figure like, oh, it's probably like the bird flu, not that big of a deal. It's not going to affect Americans. But it was pretty clear that there were many in the Trump administration who were panicked about what could happen. And Woodward knew this information. He sat on it. So you could argue that, hey, maybe he should have blown the whistle right there. Maybe other people in the administration should have blown the whistle.
Yeah, because I think you can look at, say, the example of, Bob Woodward, right? You can report on stuff at the time that's important and still write a pretty good and pretty well-selling book, as he did with Bernstein in Watergate, right? They reported stuff as they learned it, but then they also turned it into a very successful book. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. Now, like you said, he's not actively working for, say, the Washington Post anymore, but I'm fairly confident that if he called up the Washington Post and said, hey, I've got an article for you, they'd at least take a look.
Yeah. But then again, you could also argue that why weren't there other people in the administration who didn't blow shouldn't it be on the people in the administration to...
Well, clearly, but do you want to put your safety in the hands of, say, Jason Miller?
No, but
Anthony
Fauci, right? He was part of the Trump administration.
I think he was, at least as much as you can be, a fairly straight shooter. I don't think he was. I don't remember him telling us, don't worry about it.
No, definitely not at the time. But by the time it was like public information, he was very good about communicating.
And he was at
most of the information.
He was at odds with Trump a lot.
Yes. Yeah, he had a tough job.
Yeah, I don't think we can blame him. I mean, there's a lot of, at least, I don't know, as far as what I know, that it's the political side was the major problem in terms of trying to cover things up and assure us it was nothing was happening or anything like that. I was going to say, going back to the actual issue at hand with Trump,
and giving Putin COVID tests, the Harris campaign has actually already created an ad.
Well, good for them.
And then I think Tim Walz, mentioned during a rally about how Trump was still talking to Putin and things like that. Mm-hmm. So they are using it, but from like a efficacy standpoint, I don't think it's really going to move the needle in either direction.
No, I don't expect it to too much either. The way I would think it might have an impact is you kind of layer it on top of, and I think you mentioned this before when we were talking about it sort of offline, just the idea that he's not for you, he's for somebody else.
Right.
And here's another example where, hey, Americans were dying. We couldn't get a test, but Vladimir Putin can because Trump sends him things. I mean, it might be a little bit more reinforcement if you're starting to think he might not be for me. I certainly don't think it's going to hurt.
Right. And honestly, I think, and I mentioned this offline as well, when it comes to Putin, dictators, when their own health and life are at risk, they're not going to go to their own country, right? They're going to seek external sources for safety. And we know that Putin is, I don't know if germophobic is the correct term, but we've all seen the pictures where he's sitting like half a football field away from someone during a meeting during COVID. He was definitely afraid of COVID.
Yeah. And like you said, that's not new. I mean, when I grew up in Cleveland, and I believe it was the Saudi royal family that would come to the Cleveland Clinic regularly, right? They're not going to the Saudi doctors. Cleveland Clinic is pretty world renowned enough that they're going to get on a plane and go there. And people routinely go to, say, the Mayo Clinic and Johns Hopkins because we have really good care. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that Putin is going to reach out. It sadly doesn't surprise me at all that Trump is going to be receptive, but it does still disappoint me a bit.
Yeah, I mean, from like the quote perspective, Putin said, "Please don't tell anyone about this," something to that effect, and Trump's like, "No, I don't care," and Putin's like,
"Yeah, I don't really think he would have either, though."
Yeah, and Putin's like, "No, I'm doing this for you. I don't want Americans to be angry at you for this," but that's just Putin, ex-KGB.
That's how you massage a sword,
Trump,
right?
Yeah, playing Trump like a fiddle. I think pretty much everyone, my governor included, Gavin Newsom, realized if you praise Trump, then things are going to go well for you. So when we had our
not exactly a closed book, right? He's not a tough read.
But when we had, California is prone to massive wildfires, and when we needed assistance, Newsom was just praising Trump all the time. And you know what? There was no friction there. So I actually think that was a wise move by Newsom. Now, to jump to the ethics point of view, there's another person who works for the New York Times, Maggie Haberman. She wrote a book, Confidence Man, about the Trump administration. And I think this is where it actually gets a lot more controversial, right? Because in her book, she told certain information that she didn't tell the New York Times. Now, she argued that, I was on a leave of absence, blah, 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 blah. But one of the things that she knew was that back in November, Trump said, "I'm not going to leave," something to that effect. And to me, that's just negligence on her part, right? That's a really important signal that needs to be out in public. I remember.
I imagine someone leaked it to her with the hope or an understanding that it would probably be made public. Yeah, it's the kind of thing that I agree with you. That's the kind of thing that you should probably let people. It's timely, right? This is coming up soon. People should be aware of this. I have to say, I'm not exceptionally surprised, right? I think back to the conversations that we were having around the time. I think both of us were kind of a little leery that he would leave. I
was pretty dismissive of that, right?
Yeah.
Folks like Bill Maher were saying like he's not going to leave, and everyone was like, "Oh, ha ha ha, Bill!" Like what a joke. No one took him seriously, and then January 6th happened. So
yeah, and I think I was legitimately surprised by January 6th, right? I knew that he was going to fuss. I knew that it would be a hard time getting him out, but I didn't imagine that people would storm the Capitol.
Right.
But she had some insight that she should have shared. It would have
Exactly
made people a little bit more protective of the Capitol, for example.
All right. So on to our next segment, which is, I feel like, a weekly occurrence now, where we talk about the left freaking out over a New York Times poll. Now, this is actually some good news. Ever since Harris got into the race, the polling has been pretty even on the national level in New York Times polls. And this is the first one where Harris actually has a decent lead at 3 points. Now, on the other side, they have Florida at plus 13 for Trump, which is really surprising because on one hand, we know that Florida is trending red, but for it to be at plus 13, that's substantial, right?
Pretty big. Yeah. And so I one of the reasons I wanted to come out of the poll, one, we've been talking about this poll, and it was what was interesting before is that it was kind of constant and unchanging. And now it's changed a bit. So that's useful to take note of. But what I thought was really fascinating is they sort of exposed a little bit of inside information. We speculated before we were talking about it that they probably have some sort of different weighting mechanism. And they confirmed that they did. They are not weighting based on the remembered vote, right? I guess most polls weight based on how people told them they voted last time. And they try to fit their sample into how people voted last time. And the Times is making a conscious decision not to do this, especially in Florida, because they think the electorate there has changed quite a bit. So that's an interesting difference in polling, separating the Times from all the other polls, and probably explains quite a bit on why their results have been different. In some ways, especially the Florida poll, it seems like it's really erring on the side of showing more Republican support, right? As opposed to some of the polls we've seen in the previous elections, which err on the side of sort of underrepresenting Republicans. So if the national poll, that they're right, and it has been even, and now it's heading towards Harris, that's good news for the Democrats. It's kind of bad news to show the Florida news, right? So it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess. But I guess I imagine that the Harris campaign is not expecting to win Florida in any case.
No, but at the same time, there's so much money on both sides that it can't hurt to, campaign in Florida to some extent, right? Sure. Especially since they have the some sort of abortion referendum.
Yeah, but I think it's sort of actually a little glimmer of good news out of this big lead in Florida. It kind of shows how that I was been reading about this in a number of source places, that the Republican advantage nationwide in the Electoral College is kind of diminishing, right. And a large lead in Florida, which is a fairly populous state, kind of means that the race, the closeness of the national poll isn't quite as close as you'd think, right? The Florida could account for maybe a full percent of Trump's vote. So if you knock off 1% from Florida, Harris might really be up 4% nationwide, which might give her more of an edge in some of the states that really are kind of swing states. So, if the polls are close and he has a really big advantage in Florida, that's actually not bad news for Harris.
Right. Because historically speaking, you have Democratic bastions such as California, New York, Illinois, those are all wasted votes once you reach a certain threshold, right? So when it comes to Florida, there's no difference between +2 and +50, right?
There's no difference between +1 vote, right?
Right. Yeah, you're getting all those electoral votes. So, the Republican electoral advantage has always been, you have the Rust Belt, if you include Ohio, Iowa, and those. And then you have Florida, but those margins have been much smaller, right? And so as those margins get bigger, you're going to have, a stronger popular vote, right?
Yeah, I think an easy way to think about it, if you say that if you just use raw numbers, say there's like 10 million or 100 million Harris supporters and 95 million Trump supporters based on the current vote, something like that.
Sure.
If 15 million of those, or say 25 million of those are in Florida compared to 20 million of those, that's better for Harris. That would mean that the rest of his voters are distributed in smaller amounts through the other states than if there were another 5 million Trump voters that were coming from other places. I guess is probably not the most unconvoluted way to describe it, but kind of gets to the point.
We've had 2 polling podcasts since we've started, and our advice has always been to just throw it on to the averages and just wait, because fundamentally you can't do anything. This race is basically a coin flip. But what's really, I guess, fascinating to me is that if there's just an error in 2 points in the Harris direction, so basically favoring Harris, you're looking at a trifecta. Whereas if you go 2 points in the other direction, you have a Republican trifecta.
Oh yeah, so, it's really troubling how close it really potentially is. But again, I agree with you for the most part on the polls. I think this one is particularly interesting to me because they're giving more of their methodology and explaining why they're different than the other polls. So we as viewers and readers of the news, we can make a little bit more informed judgment on what we want to do with this poll. We know a little bit more why it's different, and then we can decide whether it's usefully different or not. But again, as you say, we won't know for sure until the results are in.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand the argument of not using recall vote, because I think there's a lot of data that suggests that people lie, right, about who they voted for, because they want to say, hey, I voted for the winner. But it's also kind of the only thing that you have, right? It's a good benchmark. So
yeah, I mean, if you don't believe the people that you're polling, your poll is useless anyway.
Right. So, and based on how you're sampling, you have to weigh somehow, right? Because the response rate is not going to be what the electorate looks like. So you're going to have some sort of weighting. So I don't know. I mean, I understand the argument that the New York Times is making, but there's also a reason why all the other organizations use recall vote, right?
Yep.
So
it will be interesting to compare their final assessment to everybody else's final assessment and how well those do against reality.
So yeah, I think we had a pretty wide range of topics that we covered. Polling methodology aside, I think the unifying message, though, is that we fundamentally just want people to be safe, right? Sure. People's lives are at stake. And so we want to make sure that FEMA is working as efficiently as possible. We want to make sure that we get rid of as much disinformation that could actually harm people. And there's definitely evidence that people are being harmed by the FEMA disinformation. And then when it comes to just journalistic ethics, right? We want to make sure that our journalists, they are the gatekeepers of information. And so their job should be informing the public so that we can make decisions and make sure that our country is safe.
Yep, I think that you summed that up pretty well. Right? The primary goal of the government should be to keep Americans safe. And anything that gets in the way of that is something we should draw attention to.
Yeah. So with that, we will see you next week.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care.